There was a lot of
Hyperbole.
Yep, in the opposition's nuclear announcement. So let's unpack it a little to separate fact from fiction.
Part 1.
And we've looked at the international experience. We've looked at why Australians are paying the highest electricity prices in the world. We're paying the highest power prices in the world, the highest electricity prices in the world.
So Dutton says that Australia is paying the highest electricity prices in the world. He repeated this a few times throughout the 60 minutes. I'd love to see the source for this, because based on what I found, this sounds like a furphy. In 2022, the Australian Energy Council found that Australian retail household electricity prices in the national electricity market were the lowest they've been for 8 years, and on an international comparison, the 10th lowest of the 38 OECD countries. The most recent data set I found was from September 2023, and yeah, there are plenty of countries cheaper than Australia, but it's safe to say that Australia is a long way off the most expensive. According to this data, Australia's household electricity price is significantly lower than Belgium, which generates approximately 50% of its electricity via nuclear, the UK, which generates approximately 15% of its electricity via nuclear, the Czech Republic, which approximately 33% of its electricity is generated via nuclear, and Switzerland, which generates up to 40% of its electricity via nuclear. Funnily enough, Australia was on par with France, who generate around 62% of their electricity via nuclear energy. Looking at data from 230 countries aggregated on UK website Cable, Australia is very much middle of the road when it comes to electricity prices, which aligns with everything else I've found. We're not the best, we're not the worst. And we are cheaper than many countries that have nuclear power in their energy mix. For the record, it appears as though the Solomon Islands have the most expensive electricity in the world. But Peter Dutton wouldn't be too worried about them.
Time doesn't mean anything when you're about to be, have water lapping at your nose.
We've looked at the expert advice from the regulator, who's now telling us that under Labor's renewables only policy, there is a greater likelihood of blackouts and brownouts.
So there are two furphies here in the one sentence. The first thing that needs to be said is that the current pathway is not renewables only, as Dutton repeatedly claims.
Labor's renewables only policy.
The Australian Energy Market Operator, the body that manages the electricity and gas systems and markets across Australia to make sure we have reliable energy, have published the Integrated System Plan, which is the roadmap for the transition of the national electricity market to meet the country's future energy needs while targeting net zero. There's a handy 3-page summary of it, or if you're a details guy, like Peter,
Detail.
there's the full 92-page document. Either way, it spells out the pathway pretty clearly. That is renewables firmed by storage and backed up with gas. So it's not fair to say that we're currently on a renewables only path. The second is that it would appear that Dutton is twisting what the Australian Energy Market Operator have published. I'm guessing Dutton is referring to this report, and parts of this were cherry-picked back when it was released, and selectively run by some sections of the media. To be clear, the report did flag reliability risks based on the modelling undertaken, but that's not the key takeaway. And neither is it true to say that the Australian Energy Market Operator pointed to the Labor government's policy as the cause.
We've looked at the expert advice from the regulator, who's now telling us that under Labor's renewables only policy, there is a greater likelihood of blackouts and brownouts.
The cause is not just the fact that coal-fired power stations will progressively be retired over the next decade. It also comes down to the current fleet of coal-fired power stations becoming less reliable, and they're getting older and rapidly approaching decommissioning. They're just not as reliable as they used to be, which would be a problem no matter what pathway you went down. At the time, the Australian Energy Market Operator stated that they were expecting an elevated level of risk compared to recent years, mostly due to hotter and drier conditions, and coal-fired generation reliability is at historic lows. The Australian Energy Market Operator also said that while the current scenario modelled showed increased reliability risk, it did not reflect the reliability potential from the 248 gigawatt pipeline of proposed generation and storage projects, actionable transmission projects and government energy programs underway. In other words, the Australian Energy Market Operator report excludes a range of proposed developments and other government programs aimed at ensuring reliability in the grid. Something the report did say was that planned generation, storage and transmission supported by government programs, must be delivered urgently, with any delay likely to put reliability at risk over the coming decade. Now, do you want to take a guess at what could potentially contribute to a delay in these programs? I mean, I can think of one thing. If the opposition were to make a detail-free announcement saying that they'll push nuclear power if they get into government, in turn spooking potential investors of currently planned renewable projects, that might put a delay on things, don't you reckon?
We know that the government has a renewables-only policy which is just not fit for purpose. No other country in the world can keep the lights on 24/7 with the renewables-only policy.
Yeah, this is a furphy. Firstly, once again, Australia is not currently pursuing a renewables-only policy. Secondly, Iceland can keep the lights on 24/7 on a renewables-only policy, and other countries are starting to join them. But once again, it's a moot point, given Australia isn't targeting 100% renewables under the current plan.
And today we announce 7 locations that we have looked at in great detail over a long period of time that can host new nuclear sites. It will mean that on those end-of-life coal-fired power station sites, we can utilise the existing distribution network. This is a really important point.
So the Coalition are proposing they whack the 7 nuclear plants on sites that currently house coal mines. Is this possible? Technically, yes. Does that make it a good idea? Doesn't sound like it, for a few different reasons. Need to say, first up, for a Liberal leader, Dutton's plan sounds decidedly communist, in that his nuclear plants will be government owned. Needs to be said that these sites already have owners. Many of these owners already have future plans for these sites, and those plans do not include nuclear. This would then make it likely that the Coalition would need to go down the path of compulsory acquisition and compensating the current owners for doing so. I'd suggest that the compulsory acquisition is something that could also be challenged in court if it came down to that, but I'm not a lawyer. Regardless, it sounds like this is going to take bucket loads of cash. It'll be interesting to see if all that's included in the costings, if they're ever released.
And the poles and wires that are used at the moment on the coal-fired power station sites can be utilised to distribute the energy generated from the latest generation nuclear reactors. We have the ability to do that in a way that renewables can't.
And utilising the existing distribution network? Well, as experts have been pointing out, many of the owners of these networks are already deploying wind and solar on these sites, and they're using the available distribution network for that.
Labor has promised 28,000 kilometres of new poles and wires. There's no transparency about where that will go.
The 28,000 figure is one that Dutton's rolled out a few times now. I've looked for the source of this figure and just come up with donuts, so who knows where it was really plucked from. What I can tell you is that it appears to conflict with the figure published by the Australian Energy Market Operator in their Integrated System Plan. They forecast that close to 10,000 kilometres of transmission would be needed by 2050. I'm guessing that what Dutton is doing is adding the additional transmission required if Australia was to export green energy, which was a scenario modelled in the Integrated Systems Plan. Under that scenario, it was estimated that an additional 10 to 26,000 kilometres of transmission would be required to set up an export industry for green hydrogen. This is not poles and wires to service the country's electricity grid. It's to set up an export industry that may or may not actually happen.
28,000 kilometres of new poles and wires. There's no transparency about where that will go.
And to suggest that no one knows where they'll go. I'm not sure how he can say this when later on it sounds as though he does know where they're going to go.
They go through national parks, they go through prime farming land.
Regardless, well, here's a map. 10,000 kilometres of additional transmission will be required by 2050. And the question for Dutton should then be, given you're still talking about renewables and gas, and the country is growing, wouldn't Australia still need that additional 10,000 kilometres worth of transmission, regardless of whether or not the nuclear plan came to fruition? I'd suggest that the likely answer is yes, we would at least require some of that. Besides, of the 10,000 kilometres required, 2,500 kilometres worth have already been committed and scheduled to be in place by the end of 2029. Meanwhile, we have members of the media regurgitating anything Dutton vomits up as if it were fact. And yes, Phil, the Australian Energy Market Operator have been consistent with this 10,000 figure for quite a few years now. It wasn't really that hard to find.
For more, tune in the next episode.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.